It doesn't feel right. And then we talked about the idea of shame. And last week we talked about the idea of vulnerability, the shields of vulnerability, the things we do to not be vulnerable. And really, to be totally full and free and creative, we have to be vulnerable. And this week we want to take some of those ideas and put them into perspective, maybe in the workplace, in education. Now, one of the things that Brene Brown said, and I thought it made a lot of sense as I looked at it, is that what happens in the workplace also happens in education, that they're not two separate places. Because what happens is that which is a student becomes an employee. They just change titles, that's all. They don't change who they are, particularly. And so some of the ways in which education is set up and used reflects itself in the workplace by leaders and by employees. Sometimes, depending upon the person's background and the type of education they received and the kinds of teachers they had, they are able to, in essence, feel self-worth, or maybe it's just the opposite. They don't feel real good about themselves. And so, as we start off, what I want to do is just share a story with you about Alicia. And Alicia, when she was 16 years old, went to work in Hitchen's kitchen. That's the truth, okay? Hitchen's kitchen. And she said it kind of sounds like a diner out of a romance novel. But she'd been there about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and they had a special. And the special was Swiss steak. And it was reduced significantly in price. And what she would write down was sirloin and give it to the cook. And she did this over and over again. Now, the sirloin was twice the price of the Swiss steak. Most of us know the difference between the two, right? But she didn't realize it until she had served about 15 plates, and then the boss came and got her. And in front of employees, in front of the people who were there, he went after her. He shamed her. He blamed her. And he was furious because, as she understood it afterwards and thought about it, they were losing money every time she served somebody a sirloin, okay? And the owner wasn't too happy about that, obviously. But what she described is this kind of sensation. And he was scolding me, loudly, harshly. I stood there absorbing his tirade. I was shocked and silent while that warm wash came over my torso. My stomach felt sick. Then I came to hollowness in my chest, up to my neck where the lump in my throat sat. How could I shrink away? How could I get away from this feeling? I'm drowning, I'm drowning. Save me, someone. I want to disappear. That is a description of our emotions when we feel shame. Some of you are sitting there shaking your heads yes, because you probably have experienced that. Maybe, again, from a teacher or maybe from an employer. I hope not, but most of us have to some degree. You see, in the workplace or in education, when we use shame, and we do, let me give you an idea. I spent 20 years or more managing salespeople, and you don't really manage salespeople. What you do is you train them, and if you do it right, you let them go and do their thing, because each one has to be individualized in the way that they work with people, the way they relate to people, the way they are empathetic with their customers. If that doesn't happen, then they are kind of just, coming from their head, not their heart at all. So you kind of put together the head and the heart. But one of the things that happened in an idea that I never thought of shaming, but it really was, and I wouldn't have put that word on it even then, but today I can see it, is that in the company I went to work for in sales, they had a bullpen. And in order to move into an office with another person, a two-person office, you had to have a certain level of sales. And at the end of the year, you didn't have that. You went back to the bullpen, and the people in the bullpen who had the higher sales moved into the offices. And what that, and then you get a private office if you really did well. And what that implied, and maybe it made sense at the time, but what it implied was you're not worth you're not valuable enough to have an office or share an office with somebody. And one year, I had one of the salespeople come to me who had remained in the bullpen. And he said, did you know the difference between myself and the other fellow who was moved into a private office, or not private office, but a shared office? The difference was $15 in commissions. And I said, yeah, I knew that, and I'm sorry about that. But that's the policy around here. And he said, do you know what it feels like to be in the bullpen? And frankly, I'd never been in the bullpen. I was very fortunate, I guess, in some ways. So I didn't know how it felt. I said, well, tell me how it feels. He said, well, when you bring a client in and they see you're in the bullpen, they figure you're just brand new, even though I've been here for 2 years. When you are in the bullpen, you feel like you aren't as good as the guys in the private office. It's very demoralizing. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. So the next time I built an office out, I built an office, and it's more expensive, where everybody had an office or shared an office. There was no bullpen. We eliminated the bullpen. I got to tell you, it was money well spent, because it didn't differentiate. It didn't say you are a good salesman and you're not a good salesman. Instead, everybody was treated pretty close to equal from that perspective. Oh, the top salesman got a private office, but nobody would notice the difference, really, from the outside, and the salespeople didn't feel that they were treated differently. So that was an idea of using shame to motivate people, when really that's not what works. It does not motivate people. Here's what shame does. Number one, when we use shame in the workplace or as teachers, what happens is we diminish self-worth. We don't increase it. When anybody is criticized publicly or ostracized because of the way that they do things, or because they have an idea that's a great idea, they think, and nobody else thinks it's a great idea, or an idea that they tried out and it didn't work, and because they're ostracized by that, they begin to lose confidence. They begin to become filled with doubt and fear, and wonder whether or not the next idea is worth having. They don't even want to share anything new. They start to believe they're not good enough. The second thing that happens after the idea of diminished self-worth is that the individual feels dehumanized. Dehumanized. We certainly don't teach that in Unity. But dehumanization is the idea that employees are not rewarded for their efforts or their successes or their triumphs. It's all on a staircase basis. And so that dehumanizes the individual. People then turn to become either overachievers or underachievers in order to please the leadership, to please the boss, to please the person in charge. Underachievement isn't good, but overachievement to please somebody else is not healthy either. So both come out unhealthy, come out feeling dehumanized. The third thing is the feeling of powerlessness. That when you have, again, a thought, you have a creative moment, that you do not feel the power to be able to speak up. Or when an employer treats you in such a way that it's either dehumanizing or taking away one's self-worth, you don't have the power to speak up. That you feel less than rather than more than. And so shame is used in that case. Students who come to school, who maybe have a great idea and want to share that in their classroom, and who are laughed at, and then the teacher supports the laughing at, in a sense, by their reaction and their action. In that case, that student feels powerless. And then there is the idea of unpredictability in emotions that shame causes. Because with enough shame, people get angry. That's the one, they'll hide the other emotions, but that's the one emotion eventually they cannot hide. And they become angry because they feel shamed. And it's the only way they know how to speak out. And so if you're in a workplace, or you're in an environment, or you're in a schoolroom, or an education system that uses a great deal of blame, what will happen, there will be a great deal of anger. And it's not predictable, particularly from an emotional standpoint. So that's an idea, and we've talked about this, and I don't want to overdo it, but talked about these ideas of shame over the last few weeks, and that's how it shows up, if you would, in some ways, people believe in the workplace. One of the things that I learned to do through experience was I used to say, I cannot motivate anybody. I still believe that. I can't motivate somebody. But what I can do is I can create an environment where they are self-motivated. I can create an environment where they feel as though they are worthy. I can create an environment where they feel loved. Yes, loved. Even in the workplace. Even in the school system. The first year I taught school, I taught the 5th grade. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I really didn't. And they probably agreed with me. Certainly for the first month. And what they would do is they would play tricks on me. 5th graders, can you imagine that? New teacher, play tricks on me, okay? We'd get involved in something and I'd get this. That was the first time that they used to have the speakers in the rooms where the principal, I was in a new school, where the principal could speak to you, okay? And in the second day, we got so involved, Richard got so involved in teaching that he forgot we had lunch hour. And the kids are sitting there giggling. And then all of a sudden, the principal comes on and says, Mr. Bunch, do you realize it's your time to go to the cafeteria and have lunch with your students? Or are you going to teach all day, okay? Now, he said that with laughter, thank God, and he was a great guy, and I understood it. See, he could say something like that to me because I knew him, and I understood he wasn't trying to shame me. He was joking. And the kids understood it. And so they taught me a great deal during that year of teaching. And they taught me a great deal about how not to shame them as individuals. Because in that day and time, we didn't have classes for special individuals. We didn't have classes for people who maybe were disabled in their learning ability. Everybody was together, period. 33 students together. One could learn to spell, and another one couldn't learn to spell. One could comprehend what they read, and others could not comprehend what they read. It's an interesting environment to be in. But what you learn to do to really motivate them is not, again, to shame them, but to see the self-worth in each individual person. One of the things I used to do is some of the ones who were not good students were great athletes. And so when they were out for recess, we emphasized and focused on their ability to be great athletes and made them feel good about it. And worked with them from that perspective. So we fell in love with each other as a class. I'll never forget it. And it was a wonderful experience, if you would, of finding my own self-worth. That's what they helped me do, find my own self-worth. Even though we're going to make mistakes in the workplace, even though we're going to make mistakes in our learning environment, what we can do is, when we do it right, is that we don't feel shame, we don't feel a loss of self-worth, we just feel a little guilt. All of us can do that. Because guilt, you see, you can release and let go of. When you don't feel like you're enough, when you've been shamed and feeling like that you're not enough, then guilt isn't what that is. That's not feeling you are enough, and you don't wash that away. But guilt you can release. So, one of the things that, a tagline that I've picked up on the internet, is a tagline by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It says, all lives have equal value. All lives have equal value. So when you step through the workplace, or through the door in your workplace tomorrow, or return to school tomorrow, remember that you possess a worthy, authentic essence, just the way you are. In fact, you are perfectly imperfect, is what Brene Brown says. She shows that vulnerability is the gateway to creativity, innovation, trust, empathy, joy, courage, and says, and with all that comes accountability, because we start to look at ourselves and we look at self-accountability rather than somebody pointing at us. That doesn't mean that you don't have discussions in the workplace or in the education system which are uncomfortable. It means you have those things that are uncomfortable from time to time. But you do it in such a way that you're not diminishing an individual, but instead you're lifting them up, hopefully. And if people trust you, that's what they will hear coming from you. If they don't trust you because you've shamed them, then just the opposite takes place. Now, in order to be a transformative leader, in order to encourage vulnerability in the workplace, And vulnerability takes courage. We all know that. And so in order to do that, there are several things that the experts recommend, okay? One is fostering innovation. If you go to Silicon Valley and you go into some of those companies, it's all about innovation. You cannot have a bad idea. And everybody together looks at that idea, and they then they don't tear it down, but what they are taught to do is to build up that idea by other voices coming in, other people looking at it, and how can we take this idea and make it even better? That's very self-empowering. Because the individual remembers, I had that idea originally. And that makes them feel good, and so the next time they have a new idea, they step into that new idea and are willing to share it. That's what we need to have in every workplace. That's what we need to have here at Unity of Richmond. That's what we need in our education system, is that a student cannot have a bad idea. It's an idea that needs to be embellished maybe, but it's not a bad idea. That way it creates this idea of innovation and trust and engagement in both the workplace and in education. If you want an employee, if you want a student to feel safe enough to float a new, potentially risky idea, create an environment where people can do that without ridicule. Okay, without ridicule. There's no such thing as we tried that before and it doesn't work. You want to close things down, do that. And I might be guilty of that from time to time. But don't do that, because it closes everything down. Second thing in improving motivation is that what happens is that, what I should say, is that the second thing is improving motivation. And motivation sometimes means that we are challenged to create employees in a workplace, and that we're not careful, we can leave them distracted and unmotivated. So we want to improve motivation. Now, I called it again the idea of improving the environment for motivation. If somebody doesn't want to take the initiative, I can't make them take the initiative. They have to do that on their own. They have to say, oh, I see something here that needs to be fixed, and they fix it. They don't go get somebody to fix it. They fix it, as an employee or as a student. And so instead of pawning it off on somebody else or saying that's somebody else's responsibility, we start to understand when we're motivated that we are open to helping one another, supporting one another in every way, and in small ways and in big ways. And so we then start to understand very quickly that we are able to not only do that type of thing, but we can challenge our own personal motives. We can challenge our own personal ideas so that we can return to the work healthy and whole because we're doing our part. We feel good about that. Another thing is boosting teamwork. So we've said that, number one, fostering innovation. Number two, improving motivation in the workplace. The third thing is boosting teamwork. And that's all about demonstrating empathy. I learned this from an individual that I couldn't get along with very well for many years. He worked for me. We worked together. And he and I could not get along very well. It all was about ego for the both of us, to be honest. However, one of the things he was really good at was that he knew everything that was going on in the life of just about all of our employees to some degree. He knew when somebody was going through a divorce. He knew when somebody was having a difficult time with their child. He knew those kind of things. Me, I was so busy, I didn't take time to do that. And I learned from him that technique of being empathetic in the workplace, of letting go of all the busyness and saying, how are you doing today? What's going on in your life? How are you feeling? And as you do that, people then open up to you, and in that opening up, they feel like there is a self-worth. They feel like that you are seeing them openly and care about them. But if all you do is expect a result from that individual, whether they are an employee or a student, then what happens is they shut down because they don't think you care. It's not how much you know. It's not how well you can train. It's how much you care that will make a difference and create an environment where people feel self-worth. And then and that creates, again, this teamwork idea, okay? And then the fourth thing is promoting identification with leadership. One of the most difficult things for leaders to do is to share with somebody a concern, is to sit down with somebody and say, you know what, we're downsizing. Now that word puts fear in the hearts of many. If that individual who is sharing that news is not willing to open up themselves and share the fact that they don't feel good about it either, that it's very difficult to be in that role, that they wish it wasn't happening, but it is. If they're not willing to share that, but instead become very stoic about it and say, okay, fine, let me tell you what's happening here, I'm sorry it's affecting you, and next, then again, each individual does not feel that the person cares, that the person is standing there and understands what they are going through. It's always difficult to give bad news. But we have to, as leaders and as teachers, when we do that, identify with the position of communicating that bad news. That it's not fun, that it's difficult. And be vulnerable as leaders. Instead of acting like, this is just my job. Goodbye. It was nice having you here. And what happens is you see it's harder for employees to understand or students to understand that everything that the boss is up against, that they understand the role of leadership and can emphasize back. So if the leader can empathize with them, you see when they sit together and something like that happens, there's an empathy that comes back. There's a togetherness, there's a caring that takes place. And we then learn to communicate with each other. This past week, Jim Blake, who is the new CEO of Unity Village, okay? That's what you would know it as, Unity World Headquarters, they call it today, but Unity Village, which is a separate entity than Unity World Ministries. He's brand new, and what he said is, I am a servant leader. Now, when somebody says that to you, can you identify with that? I am a servant leader. And then what he explained about that was that he wants us to believe in what we can do to care for others in the world. How we can reach out. How we can make a difference. And then he said, you know, it starts at home. It starts right where I work, about caring with the people who I work with. And I just thought, servant leader, how positive, how powerful is that? Because as a servant leader, you have that ability to inspire, that ability to grow, that ability to lead, and to serve. So what I would share with you is be a servant leader. A servant leader, not a servant, but a servant leader. No matter what your role is. When you're sitting on a team, be a servant leader. One of the things I've noticed, we have some teams here where everybody on the team knows about the other person and what they're going through. And they connect with Vicki or myself about that and help us out so we know what's going on. That's real team boosting. That's real team effort. That's what the team's really all about. It's not about what it is that we do. Teams are all about creating that feeling, that understanding, that empathy for one another. It's not the task. It's the opportunity to be in an environment where people care for you and you care for others, where you can share your love. And you see each person and you behold the Christ in every person. And so just remember that it's okay to be perfectly imperfect. And when you're that way, you will grow. Remember also that the student shows up in the workplace based on what the student was taught. And a lot of what students are taught is either shame or vulnerability. One of the two. If shame is used, then you're going to have shame in the workplace as a way of leading people. If one learned vulnerability, then what you're going to have is a leader who lives with vulnerability and who shares that and creates a workplace where there is vulnerability, where there's sometimes discomfort, where sometimes people don't, I want to say that more positively, where sometimes people understand that even though it's uncomfortable, they're willing to do what's necessary because they stay in integrity and authenticity. That makes sense? So that's what we're looking for. And tomorrow, again, when you open the door to York Grace, if you're an educator and you go to school, please be aware. Please observe yourself and say, am I here as a person who's vulnerable, or am I being a person who's living in shame, being shamed, or am I shaming others? Be the witness. Be the observer. And as you are, I know each and every one of you will behold the Christ in yourself. And when you're able to do that, you'll behold the Christ in others. That's what we want to do. We want to change the world by supporting every person's self-worth and dignity. Thank you. This morning, we have this opportunity, as we do each and every Sunday at 9 o'clock service. One of the things I love about it is to pray and to hold each other in prayer. Are there any prayer requests this morning? Yes. Thank you. Oh, come on and sit with your sister. Thank you.
My refugees from Savannah are calling. Please pray for them.
Absolutely. And can we add in, because I know that the Unity churches in Virginia Beach have closed this morning because of flooding. So can we just add in other folks too?
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay? Sure.
I also got a phone call about the people in Gloucester.
All right. All right. You're a busy soul. Anyway, let's just take a moment and let's envision each person calm, each person thinking clearly so they can take themselves in a proper manner out of harm's way. Each person stepping out as they can and supporting one another. That these storms are natural. And when we're in the way of them, they are scary. But what we affirm is that each person is protected, open, vulnerable, and knows what to do through divine spirit, divine guidance, in each and every moment of the storm, so that they truly, within themselves, feel safe. And may they know that through the power of prayer and through the power and action of hands, people on the ground, they will be supported, they are loved, they are important. And so it is. Amen.